NIS headquarters in the Central Business District of Capital Kingstown, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We are about to commence today's program from the NIS headquarters, and to do that, I would like to invite the person who's charged with the responsibility of doing the opening prayer to make their way to the lectern. I'd ask that you stand for the opening prayer and remain standing for the national anthem, which will be played on steel pan by young pianist Dijon Chance.
Let's pray. Heavenly Father, we thank you for life, health, and strength. We thank you for the opportunity to conduct once again government, business, and nation building. May everything be done in decency and order as we continue with today's proceedings. These and other mercies we ask. Amen.
Thank you very much. Please be seated. Please be seated. Our panelist today, Jejane Chance, is only 11 years old, and at the beginning of the school year in September, he will be one of the newest students of the St. Martin Secondary School. He tells me that he's a far relative of the Minister of Agriculture, Subutu Caesar. I got quite a bit of history lesson this morning from Chance, and he's excited to be here and to share his expertise with us. I'm sure you're a proud minister. I wish to recognize this morning the Honorable Montgomery Daniel, Acting Prime Minister and Minister of Transport Works, Land and Surveys and Physical Planning. The Honorable Camila Gonzalez, Minister of Finance, Economic Planning and Information Technology. He's not physically here, but he's on his way and will be joining us shortly. Members of the Cabinet of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and I think I would like to point out one of our newly installed senators, Senator the Honorable Benava Brown, who's here with us this morning. Mr. Didier Tribuc, United Nations Resident Coordinator for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. Heads of delegation of organization and agencies, development partners and donor agencies in person and virtual, USAID, World Bank, UK, Canada, EU, CDB, heads of agencies in person and virtual, the FAO, PAHO, UNDP, WFP, UN Women, UNFPA, UNICEF, and IOM. Senior officials, members of the diplomatic corps, permanent secretaries and heads of departments, senior civil servants, other specially invited guests, members of the media, ladies and gentlemen. I wish to put into context that we should have had more persons here with us this morning, but unfortunately yesterday there was a cancellation of a flight into St. Vincent, which has resulted in the low turnout of some of the representatives from of these donor agencies who should have gathered with us here this morning. Partnerships are critical and partnerships are important, and they are at the heart of implementation of the Sustainable Development Goals. The achievement of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development requires different sectors and actors to work together in an integrated manner by pooling financial resources, knowledge, and expertise. Today, we are gathered at the NIS conference room as the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines welcome its development partners in today's coordination meeting. Today's objective, to strengthen the tripartite relationship with the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, development partners, and the United Nations to improve the coordination and delivery of development support to St. Vincent and the Grenadines as the country transitions from recovery to building resilience. You'll hear more from the persons who are most qualified to tell you about that this morning. But at this time, I would like to invite to the lectern to make remarks United Nations Resident Coordinator for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, Mr. Didier Tribuc. Please put your hands together and welcome him as he comes.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Master of Ceremony, Honorable Montgomery Daniels, Acting Prime Minister, members of the Cabinet, Honorable Camila Gonzalez on his way, Minister of Finance, ambassadors, excellencies, permanent secretaries and other officials of the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, our development partners, my colleagues, heads of UN agencies. It's true that few of us have been grounded in Barbados and elsewhere due to the cancellation of more than one flight. However, they are online with us participating. Good morning again. I'm really thrilled to be with you back in the beautiful St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and on behalf of the UN team for Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, I want to extend everyone a very, very warm welcome to this morning Development Partners Coordination meetings. I'm very grateful for your presence, either in person or online, members of the cabinet and representatives of the governments. From our side, development partners, there are 17 entities who are represented. And this is really a testament of your commitment to helping St. Vincent and the Grenadines in his journey to building resilience. And I think it also symbolizes St. Vincent and the Grenadines enduring cooperation with international community. And I want to thank you, Acting Prime Minister, and your cabinet for this opportunity today. So the theme for today's meeting is from recovery to resilience. This is very timely, of course, because St. Vincent and the Grenadines transitions from successive shocks, including the 2021 eruption of La Soufrière volcano, of course the COVID pandemic. And as a result, these countries, like many others in the Caribbean, continues to grapple with increased indebtedness and limited access to affordable finance. Also the impact of the cost of living crisis and the constant structural vulnerability to climate change and natural disasters. And we believe that all those challenges really threaten SDG progress, putting the most vulnerable at risks of being further left behind. And I know, Acting Prime Minister, how dedicated you and your government are to mitigating this risk by creating the necessary safety nets and livelihood opportunities for your people. At the same time, this current situation demands that stronger and more strategic partnerships be formed to maximize the impact of development assistance in support of your national priorities to build resilience. And in that regard, this meeting we feel is very timely because many of us as international partners have initiated last year also new cooperation cycles. That's true for the UN with the new multi-country sustainable development cooperation framework, but that's also true with USAID, EU, Canada, UK, amongst others. So as far as we are concerned, as UN development partners and international financing institution, we are really here to have a prospective engagement on how we can not only pursue and renew our ongoing commitments, but also make them more effective, more coordinated, so that St. Vincent and the Grenadines can access more and better to bolster its resilience. So I think Prime Ministers and Ministers, I really must commend your government's leadership and the progress made in building resilience. For example, the efforts towards the improvement of infrastructures, including in the tourism sector, enhancing access to education, capitalizing on the blue economy are just some examples. And I also want to acknowledge your constant, genuine interest on building partnerships that matter for the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So permit me to describe a few initiatives which illustrate how the UN and partners are working really to move the needle on what you describe as SDG 17, which is about partnerships, which is somehow the bedrock also of the Agenda 2030. And this is in support of St. Vincent's agenda to build resilience. For instance, the UK FCDO and the CDB are partnering on the Caribbean Infrastructure Fund, which provides critical economic infrastructure, such as the Port Modernization Project, which is one of the flagship initiatives. The World Bank continues to provide loan financing and grants focusing on fiscal and health resilience or blue economy or disaster reduction. The EU also has recently launched the Euroclima to combat climate and biodiversity issues and will partner with UNDP to execute this program. Or UNDP and USAID, for example, further supporting St. Vincent and the Grenadines with the Carry Secure program, which aims to reduce youth involvement in crime and violence, amongst others. And I want to stress that the United Nations has increased its assistance through more and more joint programs and joint programming as a means to reduce transaction costs for our government partners, with several agencies coming together to address some of the key priorities. For example, UNDP, UNEP, the UN Environment Programme, and FAO have joined hands to harness the blue economy under the joint SDG fund. Or, for example, to advance economic empowerment and equality for women and girls, with UN Women and UNFPA working together to build back better with the support of Canada. Also to build resilient livelihood and increase food security, which is extremely crucial in those times, where we have FAO and WFP implementing a joint program funded by the joint SDG fund. And finally, building people resilience across sectors in education, health, or through social protection are certainly areas where the UN and development partners are really keen to continue supporting your government. Combating gender-based violence also remains critical for all of us, and we really look forward to engaging with you on that and strengthening our work in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Of course, there are many more in the pipeline, and that's the purpose of this meeting, so I'm sure that my colleagues today will further describe and elaborate on this potential opportunities. But yet, there are some questions. Are really our partnerships for development having the desired impact and impact at scale? Or how can we ensure that governments get the best results for the support they get? And really these are critical questions that we have in a way to explore today. So that's why one of the potential outcomes we should aim for during this engagement is really also thinking through the mechanisms and coordination for our partnerships and what has to be adjusted and changed. We already know that to comprehensively address the needs of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the international financing institutions, donors, and the UN have room to improve their collaborations amongst themselves. That's a fact. Reducing the transaction cost and the burden of too many small bilateral projects should also be our priority. And unless we do this, we really cannot say that we truly work together to support acceleration of the Sustainable Development Goals at scales. So to forge effective partnerships for the 2030 agenda, we should, for example, use innovative financing for acceleration, promoting private sector investment to build resilience. For example, the UN working with the banks to de-risk projects, whereas the government continues to adapt its regulatory framework. So these are a few examples, but this is really against this backdrop that this meeting seeks to strengthen the existing tripartite relationship amongst the government, the United Nations, and development partners. Before we get into the substantive discussion, permit me to share briefly how the UN under the UN reform has scaled up its support to Caribbean seeds. Good morning, Minister. Under the new UN multi-country sustainable development cooperation framework, we have expanded our physical presence and coordination capacity, and this meeting being held in country is one example, basically to afford countries with more tailored policy support and joint programs of UN entities. The UN support national priorities in St. Vincent with what we call an integrated country implementation plan that brings together 17 UN agencies under one umbrella. And that represents a total investment for 2022-2023 of $43 million. And we now have a UN house in St. Vincent, which is basically in this building, in the first floor. So, in a nutshell, we really look forward to hearing from you, Acting Prime Minister, Minister of Finance, members of the Cabinet and your team on the thematic areas of priorities for St. Vincent and the Grenadines where you see fit the international and multilateral partners' cooperation and contribution in these areas. I believe that at this meeting we're all committed to providing more integrated programming, increase our global advocacy for seeds, and supporting access to affordable financing for resilience building. So you can count, of course, on the UN to continue maximizing its convening power to that effect. So today's meeting will certainly build on that foundation. So as I close, allow me again to reiterate my gratitude for this opportunity, for your leadership and presence, and looking forward for a very robust conversation. Thank you very much for your presence once again.
Thank you very much, the UN President Coordinator of Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean, Mr. Didier Truebach. I'd like to acknowledge the presence here this morning of the additional presence of the Honorable Minister of Finance, Camila Gonzalez, Dr. Randy Brewster, the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Foreign Trade, Kissel Peters, and the Honorable Sabuto Caesar, as mentioned previously. Our next speaker, ladies and gentlemen, thought that this morning's activity is certainly a priority, having made previous arrangements to be elsewhere. But of course, considering the importance of today's exercise, he has joined us this morning and will be speaking to us. I speak of none other than the Acting Prime Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Honorable Montgomery Daniel.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair Lady. Honorable Camilo Gonzalez, Minister of Finance and Economic Planning, my cabinet and parliamentary colleagues, Didier Chubak, UN representative, UN coordinator to the Eastern Caribbean and Barbados, other developmental partners, senior civil servants, ambassador, ladies and gentlemen. I want to welcome all of you here this morning in the absence of the Honorable Prime Minister, who is still overseas. I'm sure that the Honorable Prime Minister would have loved to be here this morning to not only give guidance, but to establish his own presence here in this very important function. But one can always say whether or not if the glass is half full or half empty. In this case, in the absence of the Prime Minister, we want the glass to be much more than half full. Ladies and gentlemen, yesterday I had the honor and privilege of meeting Didier Chubak, who has been a frequent visitor to St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And of course, Ms. Limia El Tayeb, UNDP's resident representative to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean. I met Limia for the first time as she presented her credentials to the government of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And the government looked forward to working with her in her position for the next 4 or 5 years or so. Let me say that I had very frank and fruitful discussions with both Didier and Limia. Discussions that are leading to outstanding programs for development here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But I consider these discussions to be one much more of action, and where there will be agreements on these discussions, because of course just mere discussions are meaningless. And so, having reflected on these discussions, and although, as the chairman indicated, that I was already scheduled to be leaving here this morning, where I was leading a technical team from the Ministry of Transport and Works down to the Grenadine Islands, that I thought it equally important to be here with you this morning to not only have discussions, but to indicate what are some of the considerations I think we can place on the table for discussions. Ladies and gentlemen, I recall as a member of this government and as a member of the cabinet that the United Nations on all its platforms have been working well with our country, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I recall outside of the established programs with the United Nations, of course, that when the La Soufrière volcano erupted, immediately when the call was made by the Prime Minister for assistance, that the UN agencies responded and responded positively to his call. I recall many social programs were introduced to assist the immediate needs of many of the families who were dislocated at the time of the eruptions. And I can say to you, how happy are these families at this time? But yes, over the years, there are several programs to which the UN agencies would have responded to. I would not be able to list all of them here today, my brother Didier, but of course I can reflect on programs like the renewable energy programs. One where, of course, when we established the geothermal project, there was tremendous assistance in this regard. Equally, there is continuous work from the UN agencies, particularly with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, which has been assisting the Ministry of Agriculture over the years. And today, St. Vincent and the Grenadines can pride itself by reducing national hunger to under 5% in this country, a tremendous achievement to this country over the years. There are many more programs in the Ministry of Agriculture, but of course equally, there would have been lots of support to Ministry of Security through peace and security programs. There would have been programs for climate change and climate resilient programs. There would have been programs established in the Ministry of Education, Tourism, and much more. But today, the development partners, together with all UN agencies, are meeting here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines with government officials to improve coordination and delivery of development support to St. Vincent and the Grenadines as the country transition from recovery to building resilience. I understand that there are a number of outstanding topics to be discussed in the meeting here today. And as I look towards the agenda and matters for discussion, there is always, as I I see it. There's one area that which seems to slip through the cracks that I want to place on the table for discussion. And not only discussion, but equally for action and decision making. And that is that there seems to be a slip through the cracks when it comes to ethnic groups. Maybe because I have my own bias on this, in this regard. But world over, there appear to be many vulnerable groups to which consideration may be given to these groups. But certainly, the ethnic group may not be high on the developmental agenda. And so particularly here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, history has revealed that the treatment of our indigenous peoples, that this group has suffered long and hard over the years. To the extent that this group has lost a people, has lost a language, and has lost a culture. This group continues to be quite vulnerable. And so, I wish to place on the agenda the consideration of such ethnic group in terms of their overall improvements to national improvement of national livelihoods. I also want to place on the agenda the area of forestry restoration. Over the years, particularly from 2011 onwards, there has been a constant barrage on the forested areas of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, from tropical storms, from hurricanes, and quite recently, from the eruption of the La Soufrière volcano. There's no doubt that there has been an onslaught on the forestry here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Yes, the forestry department in the Ministry of Agriculture has been working to improve the forest at this time. And of course, we all know that the forest will regrow. It will regrow naturally over time. But there needs to be that level of support in restoring the forest, the natural forest of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as well as one can also consider that area of agroforest. And so this is also an area I want to place on your agenda this morning. And of course, not forgetting the area of climate change and the actions that it continues to, the onslaught it continues to render to particularly our east coast here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Presently, the government has just established a contract to save a village you call Sandy Bay in my constituency. In 2013, there was work that was established by a consultant to have city fence work done in 2013 at a cost of approximately $14 million. And by 2022, the actual cost to restore the sea defense in that area is well over $40 million. And so one can see the cost of the damage that continues to be done by climate change and its actions on our seacoast. It is important that we continue to have discussions, actions, and of course decisions on the effects of climate change and how we can build resilience over time. I want to express thanks to this gathering because I know that there are much more topics that they will be discussing here this morning, but I wanted to place particularly those three major items onto the agenda. And that I want to wish the meeting well this morning. And not only I myself as the acting Prime Minister at this time, but of course, I'm sure the Honorable Prime Minister, he too will be looking forward to great results from this outstanding gathering here today. Thank you very much, and I wish you all the best.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was the acting Prime Minister, the Honorable Montgomery Daniel. Today affords us the opportunity to highlight the achievements this country made in responding and recovery from the volcanic eruption and for sharing planned and ongoing interventions of development partners to address recovery and resilience. Minister of Finance, the Honorable Camila Gonçalves, will now present the government's achievements and strategic priorities for building resilience as we invite him now to the lectern to bring remarks this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Our acting Prime Minister, who I believe has to leave now for an important engagement in the Grenadines, my brother and sister ministers who are here for this very important engagement, members of ministries, line ministries, and very importantly, the members of the multilateral entities and bilateral entities as well that Didier has so very helpfully helped to gather for this important engagement. I don't know what Diano asked me to speak about: achievements, priorities, goals. That's called a budget speech in my parlance, and budget speeches tend to run for about 5 hours in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I wouldn't subject you. I wouldn't subject you to the full breadth of what she asked me to present there, because I think Saboto was 5 hours last year. Yeah, so 5.5 hours. So that would be the end of the meeting. But I'm grateful for the opportunity to do a little bit to try to set the stage for what I hope will be a conversation The ministers of urban development, of ports, of foreign affairs, of social development, of agriculture and fisheries are not here to listen to speeches. They're here to engage you on the priorities of the government developmentally, and hope that we can get some focused action coming out of this meeting rather than a series of sort of static speeches that won't do anybody a great deal of good. But I'll say this in overview. St. Vincent the Grenadines experienced COVID. It's nothing new to anyone in this room. But it was a debilitating developmental setback, particularly in our pursuit of the Sustainable Development Goals. But so what, you say? We all had to deal with COVID. So I'll see your COVID, and I'll raise you the worst drought in 40 years, Minister Caesar, the worst drought experienced in St. Vincent and the Grenadines in 40 years. Remembering always that in contrast to most of the countries in the Caribbean region, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, while we are increasingly moving into tourism, has a very strong and vibrant agricultural base that distinguishes us from most of the countries in the region. But we had a drought. But I'll see your drought, and I will raise you Hurricane Elsa. And I will see your Hurricane Elsa, and I will raise you Tropical Storm Brett. And I will see your Tropical Storm Brett, and I will raise you the volcanic eruptions of 2021. I challenge you to find any country in the world over the last 3 years that has experienced COVID, drought, hurricane, tropical storm, volcanic eruption. There are not many in that club. And each one of those challenges individually would have been debilitating. Collectively, it was a perfect storm of challenges to the common developmental aspirations of the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And each of them has a lingering effect on where we are and where we plan to be in the near and medium term. And that's where we hope that all of you come in to be part of this joint and cooperative effort to not only dig us out of that hole, but set us on the path for future development. And everything that I'm going to mention, just in passing, I hope that we'll have the opportunity to discuss them more fulsomely as the day goes on. One of you, or many of you, are involved in that goal or aspiration or project or plan. And so we're grateful for your presence. Now, in spite of all of those challenges, from an economic perspective, from a GDP growth perspective, St. Vincent and the Grenadines did not do terribly relative to our neighbors. Because we are not because all of our eggs are not in the tourism basket, we did not experience the level of economic contraction that was experienced by the more tourism-dependent countries in the region when COVID struck. The average in the Eastern Caribbean Currency Union, the average economic contraction as a result of COVID was 17%. And it would have been worse, but for the fact that we raised the average a bit, because our contraction was about 5%. There are countries to the north of us in the Eastern Caribbean who had contractions in excess of 20% of GDP as a result of COVID. But St. Vincent and the Grenadines never shut down. We continued to trade with our neighbors to the extent it was possible. We continued to have internal economic activity because we didn't have the specific days you could go to the supermarket and all of the other responses that took place elsewhere. And we don't depend as much on tourism arrival. So our contraction was severe, but relative to our neighbors, it was relatively shallow. Because of that, we were able to rebound from the COVID setback from an economic perspective more quickly than our neighbors were. The St. Vincent and the Grenadines returned to 2019 to pre-COVID levels of GDP at the end of last year, the end of 2022. None of our Eastern Caribbean Currency Union members have as yet returned to 2019 levels of production. And we're grateful for that diversity in our economy, and we're hoping even as we move further into tourism that we maintain some level of diversity and not transition out of the areas on which we've traditionally relied for growth, but that we create linkages between those areas and tourism for future development. In the year of the volcanic eruption, the International Monetary Fund, I believe they're here somewhere, they anticipated at the beginning of the eruptions a further contraction of 6% in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. But because of the very timely responses from our development partners, including the IMF, in particular the World Bank with a contingent program called a CAT DDO, which dispersed money very quickly. And because of our own contingency funds that had been set aside for natural disasters, we were able to respond much more quickly to the challenge of the volcano. I know that there are a number of you here who are stationed in Barbados, and I want to remind you all that the volcano erupted here in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, because I've seen our friends in Barbados say, "Oh Lord, you know, the 1 inch of ash that dusted us was terrible and debilitating," while we shoveled out from 3 feet of ash, and we found it a little gallows humor, but we found it a little bit humorous, the way in which the dusting of ash in Barbados debilitated the country. Didier, you were there as well. And I'm sure you had to wipe your wipers twice to get the ash off the windshield in Barbados, yeah. We had plows. The response to the volcano, I think, the initial response was strong and timely. And as a result, instead of a 6% contraction in the economy, we actually grew by 0.5%. That growth, however, was misleading. The way we measure growth in Caribbean countries, it always discounts activity in the rural areas and in the agricultural belt of the country. A lot of GDP growth is measured, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but it's measured with a lot of activity at the port, you know, stuff coming in and going out, and these things are used as proxies for other types of activity. So we had a lot of activity in the country, and that reflected as growth. But the truth of the matter is that the agricultural belt of the country was decimated. The farmers of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, if you overlay the agricultural belt with the volcano belt, it's almost the same belt. And the banana farmers, the root crop farmers, the fruit and vegetable farmers were all severely affected and taken off of their lands for an extended period of time. The constituency that the acting Prime Minister represents, if you think about, and this has a social protection element as well, if you think about the life of a farmer in the aftermath of the volcano erupted, he or she had to leave his home, leave his land, and move into a shelter. He lost his crop. He stayed in that shelter for 6 months and was unable to replant. After 6 months, he returned to his land and found it under 3 feet of ash, at which point he had to hire help to dig out from under the ash to get to the soil to begin planting again. And at that point, maybe that took him another month or two. At that point, having lost his crop, lived in a shelter for 6 months, taken a couple months to dig back out, he planted his bananas, which will take him 9 months before he can reap. So banana farmer Joe in Sandy Bay didn't have an income for a year and a half. He didn't sell a single banana. And he has bills to pay, he has children to send to school, and the entire economy of the agricultural north was put on hold for in excess of a year and a half. And that impact wasn't reflected in GDP, and it wasn't understood properly in developmental terms. But it is a struggle that we're continuing to deal with in the near term. And remember, Farmer Joe also was dealing with a drought before the volcano even erupted. And then, as soon as his bananas came up, they were flattened by Tropical Storm Brett, which is something we're dealing with. So we've had multiple challenges, some of which are not reflected in relatively robust GDP growth. Last year, our growth was in excess of 5%. This year, our growth is anticipated to be in excess of 6%. And next year, our growth again is estimated to be in excess of 5%, notwithstanding the challenges that we're experiencing in the global environment, particularly inflationary challenges and challenges related to the ongoing aggression in Ukraine. In the near term, what we sought to do was to base our immediate recovery on 3 pillars: construction, agriculture, and tourism. That we expected that there would be a rebound in tourism, and we're investing heavily in tourism. That there would be a great deal of construction taking place. We had to rebuild houses for people. We had to rebuild bridges destroyed by the volcano. We had to rebuild infrastructure, and we were engaging in other infrastructural programs. It's the same thing with the United States occasionally has these stimulus programs, infrastructural stimulus programs to try to boost economic activity. We engaged in a similar program that was based on construction. So construction, tourism, and agriculture are the near-term bases for immediate economic expansion and growth. But economic growth does not equal development. They're very different things. And what we see as the near-term economic growth levers, they're important, but we have a different list of priorities for national development. And those are the areas where obviously we want you to help us with our stimulus program, economic stimulus, construction, agriculture, tourism. But we are hoping that there's an understanding that the development of St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the medium term is bound up in a few things. One of them being our climate resilience, another being the agriculture and the blue economy, another being our pursuit of digital transformation in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and that all of it, as a matter of policy in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, as a matter of policy as explained very, very repeatedly by our Prime Minister, all of it has to be people-centered. And when we talk about things being people-centered, we're talking about our social protection floors. We're talking about continuing the recovery in individual lives from the volcanic eruptions. We're talking about citizen security. Footsteps from this building. Just last week, we experienced the worst criminal events in the history of this country. And that is likely emblematic of other challenges social challenges that we have to deal with. Engagement of the youth, engagement of young men, and interventions at the right stages to ensure that these things can be dealt with. Support for entrepreneurship, advances in education and educational access, and that includes not just formal education, but technical and vocational education, and significant investments in health. That would be the sort of the people basket of the developmental agenda. In each of those areas, the government has large and small projects to advance those interests. One of the major long-term economic investments that we have in this country right now is a port that's being built in Kingstown that is funded in significant part by a grant from the government of the United Kingdom. And we're very grateful to the United Kingdom for that support. We put the money aside for a while we were planning this thing, and we tried to resist very much the temptation to use it to fix a few potholes in the road, which is important in case there are any constituents watching here. But we also had some long-term aspirations for those resources, and the UK SIF program was the cornerstone of what will be a multi-million-dollar port development, which will make trade more efficient and make doing business easier in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We are investing in the construction of hotels in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We, the government, not because we have an interest in operating hotels or becoming hoteliers, but because an impediment to job creation in the tourism sector has been a relative dearth of hotel rooms. St. Vincent and the Grenadines, unlike most of the countries where you're located, just got an international airport within the last 5 years. And 2 of those last 5 years were COVID, when planes weren't flying. So we've had a very short experience with international air travel. And we are jump-starting the process of tourism development by constructing on our own hotels. And this is something that almost every Caribbean country has gone through in the infancy of its tourism development. Barbados has state-owned hotels. They're divesting of them now in large part, but they were required at a particular point in their development before the private sector rushed in. Antigua's had the same experience, St. Lucia's had the same, the Bahamas, Jamaica, all of them have had this early experience of having to jumpstart the process of room stock by investing in hotel rooms. We're doing that. We've also attracted some important private sector players who are building hotels in the region, in the country as well. We are building, or we are planning to build, and hopefully commencing construction later this year, a modern hospital which on the site of our old airport, which has again the potential to transform the delivery of healthcare. The hospital is part of a wider health project that has the potential to revolutionize the development and delivery of healthcare in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Our current hospital is in a flood zone. It's repeatedly flooded. It's well over 140 years old, and it is not fit for purpose. And we've been partnering with the World Bank to understand what is required in a central hospital that can deliver healthcare to both sides of the island and the Grenadines in a modern way, and that's very important. From an economic perspective, the contribution of the port to our GDP this year will be 25%. The hospital should contribute 21%. The hospital should contribute 11%, as long as we can get it going. quickly, and the hotels will contribute over 20%. That's to this GDP growth. But of course, the long-term impacts will be much stronger. We have understood from the repeated battering of storms that we've experienced that St. Vincent and the Grenadines is not climate resilient. And we have to continue investing heavily in climate resilience. I had a meeting, Minister Peters, a few years ago with someone in the United Nations in New York. We were discussing the vulnerability of housing stock in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and the fact that whenever a storm comes, people are severely affected by flooding, by winds, and all the rest of it. And the person very helpfully said to me, this high-ranking individual, you know what your problem is? You keep building your infrastructure on hillsides and close to rivers. You should stop that. And I said, you're more than welcome to come to St. Vincent and identify the plot of land that is not on a hillside or not close to a river to tell us how we can be more resilient. We have the geography that we have, and it has implications for our vulnerability. It has implications for resilience building. It's a very important part of where we want to be developmentally. Not only physical infrastructure, but in building codes, in approval methods, in planning, and in the technical support that we require post-disaster to help build and increase resilience. And the World Bank is helping us very much in that regard. The issue of climate resilience permeates everything that we do at this point. We talk about building a hospital, we have to think about climate resilience. We're building new schools in this country and repairing schools. Schools in this country are buildings in which education is delivered, but they double as shelters in the event of hurricanes or volcanic eruptions. The roads, the bridges, the government buildings all have to be climate resilient, and that's a very important part of reducing the cost post-disaster, which is a drag on us developmentally. That's something that we're very, very keen on. We are particularly keen on engaging young people. St. Vincent and the Grenadines still has stubborn levels of youth unemployment. It still has troubling levels of youth apathy and disengagement with some of the important things that are going on in the country. And we're trying to engage young people on multiple levels. We're trying to engage them educationally. We're trying to engage them in the delivery of technical and vocational skills. 3 years ago, there's a certification called the CVQ, which is the Caribbean Vocational Qualification. 3 years ago, we were delivering 50 to 100 of those a year. Now we're delivering over 1,000 a year to young people. This year, close to 1,500. Again, the UK is involved in that through the SKY program, as is the World Bank through various programs. We are, YATE, I believe is the name of the World Bank program. We as the government have a grant program called PRIME, where we give cash grants to young people with good business ideas. And we have assisted over 1,200 young people with PRIME grants. The engagement of young people in this developmental journey is very, very important to us. And whichever ways we can get that worked into our developmental milieu is very important. Critical medium-term issue is the modernization of agriculture and fisheries as a developmental imperative. We are late to the tourism game in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, a mass tourism game. And in this sense, it's a blessing that we're trying to learn from best practices and worst practices of some of our neighbors. And what we don't want to be in the situation, as in some countries, you turn to page 1 of the newspaper and it says, tourism arrivals at all-time high. And you turn to page 2 of the newspaper and it says unemployment at all-time high. And we're trying to get away from that and create linkages between existing sectors and growing sectors. And one of those main areas is tourism. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is uniquely positioned, because we still have a fairly strong agricultural base, in being able to supply the tourism plant of St. Vincent and the Grenadines as it expands with goods and products. I don't want to start naming islands here, but there are a lot of islands that can't give you the tomatoes, the pineapples, the cucumbers, the sweet peppers, the eggs that you need to keep a large tourism plant running. St. Vincent and the Grenadines is blessed to be in a different situation. But it requires a reimagining of supply chains, of logistics, of the types of crops that we produce to satisfy this burgeoning market. What we have developed over time is a system where we grow crops, we put them on boats, and we send them to Barbados and Trinidad, and some to the British Virgin Islands for consumption in those places. We have the opportunity now to bring the market to St. Vincent and the Grenadines in the form of tourists and save ourselves the challenges related to transportation of these goods. That's something that's very important to us. We have the opportunity with new players in the market to upgrade fisheries from what is now currently a very artisanal subsistence type fishing activity to more commercial endeavors. For those things we need support, we need technical support, we need advice, we need analysis, and all of that is critical in developing sectors that we think have tremendous growth potential in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and we think the blue and green economy. We think that St. Vincent and the Grenadines can be the poster child in the region for development of the blue and green economy and for connecting statistics to the lives of people that have been impacted. And that's where you guys come in. I don't want to do the budget speech. I feel myself being tugged in the direction of a budget speech at the moment. What is critical here, as I said, is that you are involved in each and every one of the developmental aspirations and goals of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. What's important to understand now is that they're doubly urgent because of the setbacks that we've experienced in the last few years, and that the young men and women over there, I do believe for the first time I'm the oldest person standing in a group of government ministers. So that's a sign. It's a sign of my own vintage now. But the young men and women, they are very impatient for change, very impatient for transformation, and we have been set back. And there's a lot of work to be done. What we ask for, in addition to your continued engagement with us, is your understanding of the specificities, the characteristics, the idiosyncrasies of the developmental challenges and goals in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I know all of you report to someone higher up the chain who has flattened the Caribbean into one thing. The Caribbean is the Caribbean, and the islands are. And we know that in terms of making aspirations reality, we know that that's not true. There is one island nearby that is flat that has implications for their infrastructural development. There's us, we're mountainous, that has implications for our infrastructural development. There are some countries that have had decades of free education. We just moved to universal secondary education a couple decades ago, in 2005. That's a big difference when you're talking about human capacity. There are countries that exist where the population exists on one island. There are countries like us that are part of a multi-island state in which 9 islands are inhabited, and the delivery of services and skills is different in that situation. There are countries that have had a long history of mass tourism. There are countries like ours or like Dominica that are just coming to that. And each of those distinctions has meaning for where we want to be developmentally. And each of the populations have chosen governments that have a different set of priorities in terms of where the people see themselves going, and they've elected leaders accordingly. And if we aren't cognizant of the differences, and if we aren't cognizant of the policy prescriptions that the people have come up with, we risk a disconnect. We risk having someone on high saying, well, I believe that the next initiative for the Caribbean people is X. And you come to us and you say, well, here, guess what? We have $5 million, and this $5 million is for this program that we have devised for you. Say thank you. And then we're in a position where we're trying to mold what you have come up with to what our developmental priorities are. And sometimes the fit is not as seamless as one would think. So what we would like is that we have an understanding of our differences, we have an understanding of our specificities, and we engage early to understand what the priorities are in each individual country. I know it's more efficient from an aid delivery standpoint and from a cooperation standpoint to have your St. Vincent expert relative to your Barbados expert relative to your Antigua expert. But I think that it is useful in harmonizing objectives, and I think that's something that we need to take a look at. The other thing that I hope we can do, and I'm really grateful to Didier for this, is the idea of coordination between and among cooperation partners. We rarely have this type of meeting. I don't know if we ever have. We'll have a meeting with the British to discuss what we and the British can do together. Then we'll have a meeting with USAID to discuss what we and USAID can do. We'll have a different meeting with the World Bank. We'll have a different meeting with the European Union. We'll have a different meeting with the Caribbean Development Bank, et cetera, et cetera. And because of that, you have it's the lingo of the day, you have silos where we are discussing this program with the British and this program with the European Union. And sometimes there's duplication, sometimes there's overlap, sometimes one thing retards the other. And it would be very useful if we can have coordination early, particularly on significant projects, so that people are feeding into it at the correct time on the developmental cycle. If there's someone who's doing technical assistance, that needs to come before the guy who is going to fund the construction of the project or whatever. And sometimes things don't harmonize, even though we all have the same goal. And I think that meetings like this, where we can get everybody together to discuss common plans and common aspirations, can help if we can all get on the same page at the same time. I know we're all representing massive bureaucracies that would embarrass our bureaucracy, Saboto. Our bureaucracy, I think, is the smallest one in the room at the moment, and we know how hard it is to get it to move. But it would be useful. It would be useful if we can improve harmonization and coordination in that regard. Because I do believe that we're all in pursuit of the same objectives. And because this ever younger government is more and more impatient, we have a very, very strong imperative for rapid change. We are very much eager to hear you, to hear from your side what you think we could do better, and how you think we can better take advantage of your very, very generous support. And we have our own ideas about making clear to you where that support would be best targeted to make a real difference in the lives of people, because we are ultimately people-centered. And we hope that the conversation today can lead us to finding those common areas where goals and objectives match on both sides, and we can do better and do more for the people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. I'm very happy that Didier organized this. I'm very happy that some of our ministerial powers are here. Tourism, agriculture, social development, urban welfare, urban planning, ports, foreign affairs are all in the room, and I think that those will be the ministers and the ministries that best encapsulate the developmental aspirations of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. So I hope that we can have a good conversation today, and I hope that at the end of it, not only will we say, let's do it again, Didier, but when we look at this, when we look back at this 6 months from now, we can say that the meeting was significant in improving the delivery and of support and the cooperation between the government and development partners in helping to lift St. Vincent and the Grenadines higher. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Gonzalez. I'm sure you will agree that minister spoke to the theme. That's all I'm going to say. I was going to comment on the length, but I'm sure you're better positioned. I'm sure you're better positioned to make comments on that. Thank you very much again once more, Minister Gonzalez, and I thought your presentation was very effective, and you did speak to the theme, even though you hinted at the beginning that, that you weren't sure that you were able to do that. So ladies and gentlemen, let me thank you very much. You have been a very attentive audience this morning, and we will go into the discussion and the question and answer session of the presentations this morning. I want to thank my media colleagues for being here, and thank you so much for your service that you always render to the government and people of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. Just a quick pause while we allow them to conclude their part of this proceedings, and then we'll go into the discussion and questions and answer segment. Thank you.